All right, everyone, welcome to your first module of ANTH 160, World Archaeology. So in today's class, we'll talk about the evolution of archaeology as a discipline and some of the key methods that we archaeologists use to interpret the past using material culture. So let's get into it. We can think about the origins of the modern discipline of archaeology as having kind of four major historical eras linked to particular ways of thinking about the past and studying material remains. The earliest evidence we have that people were making a kind of conceptual distinction between the past and the present comes from Europe during the Renaissance. Think roughly the 14th through 16th centuries. A key figure during this era was a poet and linguist named Petrarch. Petrarch viewed the classical Rome and Grecian worlds as the kind of absolute pinnacle of human social and cultural developments in the past. Petrarch made a critical contribution to the study of ancient Greece and Rome when he rediscovered and began to translate and interpret classical texts and objects that had been largely ignored during the preceding medieval period. Thanks to people like Petrarch, who popularized and glamorized classical antiquity, by the late 1700s, a growing number of Europe's leisure class considered an interest in classical antiquities to be a key ingredient in cultivating good taste. This group of amateur collectors of antiquities are referred to as antiquarians. Antiquarians are people who studied antiquities largely for the sake of the objects themselves, not really to understand the people or culture who produced them. So this is kind of like the study of art for art's sake. Antiquarians were just interested in having and collecting beautiful objects. Antiquarians, as you might have guessed, were largely unscientific in their approach to studying and collecting antiquities. Instead of answering questions about the past using these pieces of material culture, they were basically just interested in filling up their curio cabinets with art objects and recording and preserving national architectural treasures, things like Trajan's triumphal arch in Italy. By the turn of the 19th century, things began to change in terms of our early archaeological ancestors. A critical moment in this early history was the discovery of the first hand axes alongside the bones of extinct mammals in gravel pits in England and France during the 1830s. These stone tools and faunal remains shifted the focus of scholarly interest away from classical Greece and Rome and into the deep past. Importantly, these discoveries challenged the commonly held belief that humans arrived on Earth in 4004 BC. Now, you might be asking yourself, how did we get such a specific date for when we think about the appearance of humans on Earth? So this date, 4004 BC, was determined during the 1600s by the Archbishop of Armagh in Ireland, a man named James Ussher. So James Ussher basically used biblical family trees to go back in time and to determine that the creation of the earth and Adam and Eve began at sunset on Saturday, October 22nd, 4004 BC. And Ussher's view of when humanity came into existence was the prevailing idea until these critical discoveries in the early 1800s. Almost 30 years after the first discovery of these ancient stone tools in the gravel pits of France, scholars had gathered enough evidence to confirm that Ussher's theory was in fact incorrect, and that humans had been on Earth for way longer than 4004 BC. Charles Lyell, who wrote a book called The Geological Evidence of the Antiquity of Man, provided clear geological evidence for human existence prior to this time period. Lyell's assertions were supported by the works of Charles Darwin, whose Origins of Species, published in 1859, added clear evidence to the antiquity of man. The discovery of artifacts from the deep past showed that life on Earth preceded what biblical scholars had argued for centuries. This opened the floodgates for a more rigorous study of humanity's material past. During this time, the budding field of archaeology became divided between those who studied the classical Greek and Roman antiquities and those who were interested in humanity's early biological and social evolution. Over the course of the 1900s, archaeological interest spreads from Europe into North America. Alongside this continental expansion was the professionalization of the field, as more practitioners began to receive formal training in universities in the types of archaeological methods like excavation and stratified sampling that we'll talk about throughout this course. By the end of the 20th century, archaeologists were no longer collectors or treasure hunters. They were full-time scholars who made their finds available to the public through museums and university repositories. In North America in particular, the archaeological remains and material culture of Native Americans was viewed as particularly helpful in tracing back the ancient practices of our early hominin ancestors. For many of these early archaeologists in North America, Native people were viewed as living fossils. So the idea basically was that if you studied the material culture of Native Americans, you could actually learn about the social practices of ancient man 30,000 years ago. During this time, this kind of new period in archaeological history, most archaeologists were concerned with what we might call culture history. So the main goal of culture history was to track the development of prehistoric cultures by documenting how material culture changed over time and across space. A key component of the culture history approach is what's referred to as relative dating methods. So before we get into talking about dating methods, the big idea in culture history was basically that differences in numbers and styles of artifacts across sites represented distinct cultures. Changes in artifact numbers over time, for example, in types of pottery found in different layers of a site, were attributed to the spread of ideas from other cultures or the replacement of one culture by another. So basically, in the culture history approach, you have a one-to-one relationship between artifact types and cultural types. So as many different artifact types, pottery types as we could imagine, culture historians said there were that many different types of cultures, right? So you can kind of see in the diagram behind me how they would correlate particular projectile styles to particular cultures. So in terms of relative dating, basically what that term means is that you place objects in chronological order using their relative relationship to one another. So the key method that we use in archaeology to find relative dates is stratigraphy. So stratigraphy is basically a word that refers to differences in soil types that appear within an excavation unit. So you can see behind me an excavation unit with all sorts of different objects hidden or layered and buried within each of these different types of soil layers. And so each one of those little soil layers would be called a strata. So what stratigraphy does is to look at the relative relationships of objects within these different soil types or strata. The goal is that by documenting changes in artifacts within a given site, we can actually understand change over time and how that particular area was being used. Another key relative dating technique popularized during the culture history phase of archaeological research is called seriation. Seriation involves ordering artifacts based on the frequency of artifact styles across sites. So seriation is based on the basic idea that one cultural style slowly replaces an earlier style over time. So the idea here is you could take things like different types of bottles, like in the image behind me, and you could compare the styles that we have within a given site, and you would use their relative relationship to each other within the excavation unit to understand how people were changing the styles of bottles they were using over time. Scholars begin to challenge culture history paradigms starting around World War II, so beginning in about the 1940s. A new era of archaeologists begin critiquing this practice of compiling lists that describe and kind of classify artifacts into these cultural groups. One of the key kind of contributors to this was a figure named Walter Taylor. So Taylor made a couple of key contributions here. He argued that we need to think about the function of artifacts, not just how many there are. He also said that we need to use artifacts to understand human behavior and cultural dynamics. So he was basically saying we need to use these artifacts to ask questions about how people in the past were living, not just to classify them according to a particular material type. The other big thing that Taylor argued for is the need to quantify data in ways that could be used to test hypotheses about the past. So Taylor's critiques were taken up and elaborated upon by a man named Louis Binford. He's probably one of the most famous men in the history of American archaeology. You can think of him as like the godfather of American archaeology. So during the 1960s, Binford became the champion of what became known as processual archaeology. Processual archaeology represents a radical break from the culture history approach of the previous decades. The culture history approach was about writing kind of narrative history from artifacts and argued that historical principles like trade, migration, invasion were drivers of change. That's not what processualists believe. Processualist archaeologists wanted to make sure that we weren't just making up all of these kind of historical narratives that culture historians were putting out there about people in the past. And they said the way to do that was to use the scientific method to answer the question, how do we know what we know about the past? So processual archaeologists were primarily interested in explaining cultural processes, hence the term processualists. So there's kind of 5 big things that we can think about as being key facets of the processualist approach to archaeology. So they were really interested in looking at the external factors which caused culture change. Particularly, they were interested in how did the environment, changes in the environment over time, impact cultural developments. They also focused a lot on explanation rather than description, which is an important difference between culture historians who primarily described artifacts and processualists who are about explaining why we see the artifacts that we do in particular places and times. So they were firmly against this culture history belief in that kind of artifact types could represent entire cultures. And they said one artifact assemblage does not represent an entire culture. Instead, we have to look more broadly and comparatively across all sorts of samples. Processual archaeologists are also very interested in looking at dynamic systems. So looking at the dynamic feedback relationship between culture and the environment. So a key component of processual approaches were the development of absolute dating methods that added that quantitative rigor that Williams and Binford Taylor and Binford were asking for to the archaeological record. So absolute dates are based on a fixed scale extending back from the present. So think about how we use calendars, right? So we use a Christian calendar, but there's also things like the Mayan calendar. Like this one behind me. The other way that we can think about using this kind of fixed scale to come back in time is by using scientific techniques like radiocarbon dating and what's called dendrochronology, or the analysis of tree rings. So let's go first into dendrochronology. So the most precise scientific technique that we currently have for dating archaeological sites is dendrochronology. This is a technique that was pioneered pretty early on by a man named A.E. Douglas, who was actually a faculty member here at the University of Arizona. What Douglas did was to compare tree ring sequences from living trees with older archaeological samples to create a chronology for the American Southwest. According to Douglas, each ring within a tree ring represented one single year. So all you had to do to figure out how long a tree had lived was to count the number of rings. You could then compare these numbers of rings relatively to trees that were older and older to create a chronology. Another commonly used absolute dating method is radiocarbon dating. So basically anything organic can be dated using radiocarbon methods. This includes things like charcoal, wood, soil, seeds, even bones and hair. Radiocarbon dating measures the radioactive decay in organic material. So essentially what we're looking at when we look at radiocarbon dates is the rate of decay. So radiocarbon refers to carbon-14, which is an isotope of the carbon element. Carbon-14 is a pretty unstable and weakly radioactive type of isotope, so it's really good for measuring decay. So the first thing that we look at in terms of radiocarbon production, right, is by breathing, by existing, we produce carbon-14 that's circulating around us in the atmosphere. Over time, carbon-14 is oxidized and forms carbon dioxide. Carbon dioxide is used by plants in photosynthesis, and carbon-14 is incorporated into plant tissues. Most of carbon-14 is actually absorbed by the oceans, so we always only have a small sample of the amount that actually makes it into the archaeological record. So animals consume plants, and the plants have carbon-14, and those carbon-14 molecules are incorporated into animal bones and other tissues through the metabolic process. The same thing with humans. Humans eat animals who've eaten plants that have carbon-14, and so we metabolize carbon-14 isotopes. When animals or humans die, their metabolism stops, and their tissue stops incorporating carbon-14 from the atmosphere and from the things that they eat. Carbon-14 begins decaying into N14, and the proportion of carbon-14 begins to decrease. So what we're measuring then is the ratio of that remaining carbon-14. Radiocarbon dating is basically a method designed to measure the remaining amount of carbon-14. By knowing how much carbon-14 is left in a sample, the age of the organism when it died can be known. Tree rings are then used to calibrate radiocarbon dates to actual calendar dates. The final major phase in the history of archaeology begins during the 1980s. In 1980, Ian Hodder organized a series of graduate seminars at Cambridge University in England. The volume that resulted from that seminar was entitled Symbolic and Structural Archaeology, and really levied a pretty heavy critique against the scientific processual methods of 1960s and 70s archaeologists. This volume, edited by Hodder, is now considered the first explicit move towards what is called Post Processual archaeology. The major critiques that post-processualists were levying against processual archaeology was basically that archaeology was so rational and mechanical that it had become dehumanized. They levied a lot of different critiques against processualists, but some of the big ones include the fact that they viewed processualists as being uncritically accepting of positivism. Basically, they critiqued the fact that they relied too much on the scientific method as an infallible method for understanding the past. They also critiqued the kind of emphasis that processualists put on functionalism and environmental adaptation. And they said that this led processualists to focus way too much on external factors, like the environment, when explaining culture change. They also critiqued the overemphasis of processualists on social stability, of system stability, and said that focusing too much on stability actually ignores a whole host of important factors like social relationships and human cognition and things like ideology and religion in influencing social developments and culture change. So the big idea that post-processualists added to archaeology is that they shifted our understanding towards the structure of society rather than how societies change. So it was about understanding how societies work and how systems were structured rather than understanding change over time, which was the big kind of emphasis of processualist archaeology. Ultimately, post-processualists argued that quantification is not the only goal of archaeology. Instead, they supported a focus on the role of culture in shaping human behavior and social systems, rather than just the environment. Of course, the environment's important, but post-processualists were interested in making that picture a little more complex. Post-processualists also pay attention to the historical context and historical change, rather than just on documenting stable social systems. Importantly, post-processualism acknowledges the active role of scholars in constructing the past. So that completes our history of archaeological theory and a little bit on methods for today. We'll keep exploring how archaeologists use these different types of dating methods in your activities over the course of the summer class and in our lectures. I look forward to seeing you in Module 1.2.